I think we're on.
Yes, sir, we are live.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to folks back in the US. This is the second discussion of the second edition of Samvad, which is a student-run initiative of the Center for New Economics Studies. We welcome to our dear panelists and to those who've joined in. Briefly, let me elaborate a little bit on what Samvad is and what it has been doing over the last 6 to 7 months. Samvad is organized with a vision to have a more accessible, decentralized platform for young students and research scholars to connect with distinguished thinkers, scholars, researchers for a critical reflection on existing social, political, and economic realities of our time, largely those that are observable in context to contemporary India, but also rest of the developing world. All members of a core research team participate in the forum along with students and faculty members. The broader purpose of each Samvad dialogue is to encourage a more informed process of a collective discussion, which helps in creating, hopefully, a process of ideation among students, enabling them to further push the envelope in research. More importantly, what we want to do from each session, and the reason why there's so much of work that happens behind the scenes in framing each of the questions, is that we want to also identify what new areas of study, cross sectionally speaking, can we identify within and across social sciences for the work that the center does. Just to briefly mention about the center has been running for the last 5 years, housed in the OP Jindal Global University campus. But the work that we do largely is to introduce ethnographic styles of research in core economic analysis. Our focus is largely on issues around focusing on the unorganized, informal segments of the economy, but taking a different approach to our process of data collection. We've had around 8 student-led initiatives that have been working as part of the center, with each initiative trying to achieve a different end to what research possibilities can be explored over a period of time. Having said that, for Samvad, this semester's theme, we've looked at identifying India's political economy landscape, growing challenges and possible resolutions. We had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Ratin Roy and Ms. Yamini Iyer last week on the subject of political economy of fiscal responsibility. And this was right before the budget, where questions on fiscal responsibility again are out, and will be asked, given the explosion and deluge of debt that we are seeing across the segments of economy. And I think by September, October, things will start unpacking themselves more. Thank you again for joining this evening to our dear panelists. I'll briefly introduce each one of our guests for today, and then talk a little bit about what topic are we diving in. Um, Welcome, Dr. Manpreet Sethi. Dr. Manpreet Sethi is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies, famously what we call as CAPS in New Delhi. She's been leading the project on nuclear security at the center for the last 18 years, and is an expert on the entire spectrum of nuclear issues, ranging from nuclear energy strategy, non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, and ballistic missile defense. She's authored, edited, and co-authored 8 books and 3 monographs, and has published about 100 papers in books academic journals of repute. Her recent book, sorry, not so recent, but back in 2009, her book, Nuclear Strategy, India's March Towards Credible Deterrence, is deemed as an essential reading at many colleges and armed forces institutions. Dr. Sethi received her PhD from the Center for Latin American and West European Studies at the School of International Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University back in 1997. Soon thereafter, she started her career as an analyst specializing in nuclear issues at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi's only national security think tank at the time. Dr. Sethi lectures regularly at the National Defense College and other leading establishments of Indian Armed Forces, police, and foreign services. She is the recipient of the prestigious K. Subramaniam Award in 2014, an honor conferred on a scholar for consistency and excellence in strategic and security studies. In a rare honor for a civilian, on the occasion of the Air Force Day on 8th of October 2020, she was commended by the Chief of the Air Staff for her dedication and professional ability. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. It's a pleasure and honor for all our students and us to have you. Um, we have with us Ms. Mitali Mukherjee, who is a fellow at Observer Research Foundation, again, ORF, back in Delhi. Her key areas of interest and expertise are gender, finance, and media ethics. She's one of the most well-known faces in the world of business journalism. With close to 2 decades of experience in journalism, she's handled a wide range of subjects from politics to global and local economic reportage. Mitali is a Chevening Fellow for the South Asia Journalism Fellowship of 2020. She's also a TEDx speaker, Raisana GG Asian Forum for Global Governance Young Fellow, and a steering committee member of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. She was formerly markets editor at CNBC TV 18 and has also worked with the TV Today group, BBC World, The Wire, where you must be hearing her excellent, I think, interactions that we all get a chance to learn so much from, and Doordarshan. She's a gold medalist in television journalism from IIMC Delhi and a gold medalist in political science. Mitali brings a unique perspective to her interactions and connects instantly with readers and viewers alike. We all know that. So thank you so much, Mitali, for being part of this. We also have with us Ms. Akriti Vasudeva. Akriti is a research analyst with the South Asia program at the Simpson Center. Her research focuses on US-India defense and strategic cooperation, geopolitics of South Asia, and the Indo-Pacific and Indian foreign policy. She's also editor-in-large at South Asian Voices, an online magazine featuring strategic analysis and commentary on the security, politics, and economics of the subcontinent. It's a platform which most of us as young scholars have tremendously, I think, benefited from. In the initial stages of my own writing, I used to contribute for SAV quite often, and I think it's an excellent platform for those who are looking to write and get very critical and deep-read feedback on areas of not just foreign policy, but also in areas of cross comparative politics, comparative economics as well. So I strongly encourage our students and viewers to engage with the platform over the course of time. Previously, she worked as a print journalist in India, reporting on environmental issues for the Indian Express in Mumbai and on education policy for Hindustan Times in New Delhi. She's held research positions at the Embassy of India in Washington, D.C., and the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses in New Delhi, among others. She holds an MA in Asian Studies from the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University, and a bachelor's degree in engineering information technology from the University of Mumbai. Thank you so much, Akriti, for joining us this evening. For today's discussion, folks, we're looking at trying to understand what could be the likely or potential implications of a Joe Biden presidency on US-China-India relations. Just to give a little bit of a context before we get into inviting our panelists for questions and responses, the US President Joe Biden has, as we've been seeing, building his cabinet for the transition that needs to come about in what one could see is a deeply fractured and fragile political economic landscape, not only in the US, but in most of developed and I would say the developing world. Socially, the nation, that is the United States, hasn't been this divided in modern history. Economically, also, given how the pandemic has dragged America's economic boat, it would be very important for the Biden administration to work and develop a comprehensive plan as it envisages to do to build back America and also integrate with the rest of the world. Many scholars, writers, and political commentators are already welcoming the prospects of reviving moribund multilateralism once a Biden Harris administration has taken office. But most, including myself, and I've written about this, feel that this might be a little far fetched to presume, and so might be all the international projections emerging from a change of guard in American leadership. The real focus of Biden and his new administration may be initially on the problems to fix at home, especially when it comes to its plan on strengthening the American economy. We can see that for the Buy America plan that is strongly being pushed for. Still, for Biden's administration and its approach to on areas of foreign policy, economics, and even security diplomacy, there's merit in having a principled approach to an economic plan that enables a nation to prioritize its own interests, resources, factor endowments, as having a overt unilateral dependence on another. The focus needs definitely in a certain way to be building capabilities of both America and Americans. And in trying to develop a more capability centric policy approach, conditions for Americans can be hoped to be better off only if there are certain significant changes in terms of the socioeconomic landscape as well. That is, in terms of having access to better affordable healthcare, higher wages, affordable housing, and better quality jobs. But in all of this scenario, it's important how America's own economic trajectory in the future remains broadly entwined in the way it imagines, or I would say reimagines, its relations with China. China, in the 2 decades since it joined the WTO, has grown now to be the world's second largest economy and is still a massive employer and a key market for many American economies. While at the same time, in the eyes of many, it is also seen as a country which has been stealing US technology and often skirting international rules, including for, the endless debates around exchange rate devaluations and, the management of cross country monetary policy frameworks. While the Chinese may dispute these allegations, Biden's own administration will need to find a way to work alongside China, maybe not against it. To get a little bit more of an insight, it's also important to look at where India offers a significant leverage for the United States as a partner, not just within the South Asian region alone, but as a strategic player in countervailing a growing Chinese presence in the rest of the world. What's required then? Well, a conversation that can help us understand and look at some of the implications of a Joe Biden presidency and what the presidency can have in terms of its effects on the economic, geopolitical, and security implications around the world. We'll start with theme one, and there are three themes for our conversation today. The first theme that we want to look at is what could be the likely economic implications of a Biden presidency on US, China, and India relations, but those with far-reaching effects in part of the developing world. I'd like to get Mithali, you first for a question on which is asked by Karthike. Earlier this year, the outgoing US ambassador to India, Ken Jester, remarked that PM Modi's Atmanirbhar Bharat push may limit trade ties between both nations, that is the India and the US, and develop more protectionist tendencies in India's trade outlook. What are your thoughts on this? How do you see India's own trade scenario shaping vis-a-vis the US and China in the next few years? Also, just to add on, how do you see the likelihood of a US-India trade deal shaping up under the new administration, given the existing trend of a belligerent China and the push for Biden under his Buy America slogan and with PM Modi on the Atmanirbhar Bharat plan, both being, as one would say, largely inward-looking economic policy packages? Mithali, off to you.
Dipanshu, thank you so much first for your warm words of introduction. And it is a pleasure and honor to be with such fantastic panelists. My congratulations to you for doing anything but setting up a panel, first of all. So it's really, really lovely to be with such bright women. There's so much in your question. So perhaps I'll take some parts of it and then pause to see whether there's something that you or the students would like to come back with in terms of feedback. Let me take the part about US India relations first in the context of trade ties. And I want to do a little bit of history before that. We've actually always had extremely strong trade ties. I think that is, it's a truism. So I'm just putting it out there. Between 2000 to 2018, there was actually more than a 7 times jump in terms of the bilateral trade. You're absolutely right about the fact that things have turned a corner. In fact, I would, go further to say that not just did Kenneth Juster say that, he also said that he experienced the most frustration and friction in the US India bilateral trade through this period. Some of it is India's own stance, and some of it, I think, is an outcome of the last couple of years and protectionism in general. India took the first step, I would say, a couple of budgets back when then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley decided to bring in import tariffs. And, I think that was really the start of some of that entire process or that entire cycle, which you are now seeing budget after budget. With every budget speech, you will see a layer of import tariffs that are being added on various categories, this time on electronic goods, on mobiles, on so much. And really, this is just another way of saying, we're setting up more walls between us and them. Trade between India and the US actually slipped a bit in the year gone by. Now it's difficult to nuance that and say why it happened. Did it happen only because we're getting more protectionist, or was it a general trend, which is also true across the world, where trade with other countries did dip, not for China, but for every other country, it actually did dip. I think, and I'm stepping into Dr. Sethi's space here, I'm sure she'll have so much more to add, but I think you need to also, divide when you're talking about our ties between trade and defense ties, because trade has certainly seen some pushback, but defense has not. That's one space we've done quite well in. We've seen quite an escalation in terms of the size, the monetary size of ties that we did right up till 2019. um, Having said that, Dipanshu, I think if you trace back a little bit, there is some hesitation in trade ties with US. I think they are often perceived as the larger party. They're often perceived as the one who comes and calls the shots at the table and leaves very, very little wriggle room. So I don't think it's a one-sided argument over here about India wanting to be an Atmanirbhar Bharat, but there is a lot that's baking on that side as well. Uh, that, I think, roughly is the context that I would set out for US and India. So going forward, I would say that even though this is seen as a bilateral success, one needs to be mindful of the fact that there are other threads that are coming into this conversation. For example, the political economic environment. You may have seen this big, sort of face-off that broke out with the farmers' protest. First, it was Rihanna, then there was a comment from the US Embassy itself, which was quite nuanced if you looked at it. I mean, they talked about the farmer protest on the one hand, but they did bring up the issue of whether or not free internet access is something that should be considered a fundamental right. So I think we're now walking on slightly tricky terrain. It would be a fallacy to say the US is still seen as some sort of big boss that tells the others how to behave. They're not class monitor anymore. But I would say that this will begin seeping into relations and trade ties. I'm going to pause there because there's so much more to talk about, but I do want to get other people's voices in.
Yeah, so just Manpreet ma'am, if you'd want to add something to what Mitali said on the same question, yes, please.
Thank you so much, Dipanshu. And I also want to start by thanking you for inviting me for this panel. Um, Samvad appears to be a very useful platform, I think, for connecting with students and with young scholars. And as the intellectual wealth of India, I think it's just so important that we engage with uh, the resource that we have in terms of our youth. I remember my mentor, Air Commodore Jasjit Singh, used to say that because of India's size and its resources, materially it will rise to power at some point or the other. But are we investing enough in India's intellectual rise to power? And I find that Samvad is just the perfect platform for contributing to that rise for India. Now, on the question that you asked, I don't have Mitali's expertise on the economics of the issues. But to get direct to the question, which was about uh, would Atmanirbhar Bharat or Buy American constrain US-India relationship? I think not. I think it's Atmanirbhar Bharat is a push for the Indian industry to take center stage, which we've been waiting, it out for so long. And Atmanirbhar, as I interpret it, is not just about self-reliance, which is most important for a country of India's size and the kind of requirements. Because the more dependent you are, the more are your vulnerabilities that get into the way. But Atmanirbhar, besides self-reliance, is also about bringing that self-confidence into the industry to be able to engage with the world. So yes, you're right. Across the world, we are seeing protectionism. But at the same time, there is also a realization that you need to have the products produced in the best possible way at the lowest cost possible. And here is where I find opportunities of engagement between India and US, where the companies will reach out for low cost production. And I think India has the added advantage of an educated, youth, a high skill set on many issues, English language, which is not always available across, some of the other countries. We have an aspirational population, which looks at the US as that, aspirational perch that you want to get to. And there's a good regard for the US. So as a result of that, I find the two communities could be engaging with each other much more to contribute to what India's vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat is. So yes, the trade ties have dipped, and there are very many reasons. Yes, the defense engagement has increased, and again, you pointed it out, Dipanshu, in the beginning by saying that the US wants to use India's leverage for countervailing China. Now, India has its own reservations about that, but we'll get to that perhaps later in the conversation. But just to stick to the point that you were making about Indo-US economic relations, I think there is plenty of scope here. It's just how we position ourselves and get that going.
Right. Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Mitali. I'll come to Akriti just in a bit. Just a follow-up question, which is, I think, connected with this one. If you look at the numbers on India's end as well in terms of trade partnership, both US and China are its two top trading partners, and they have been for a while. While India enjoys the trade surplus with the US, it has largely with the deficit with China, and that's been a concerning issue. And I think that just got exacerbated over the last year after the border standoff, which I think has also become a major political issue across the board for many countries connected with India. In one of your interviews, Mitali, with Professor C. Rajamohan, he mentioned that Biden will push has not been an easy partner. There can be a common ground for both the countries to agree upon. And overall, the trade relations with India may seem to improve. That's a point which you've made as well. Given Biden's own stance, can India be expected to ally with the US to reduce dependence Chinese imports? Are there areas, for example, that you can identify where India and US can partner more effectively in terms of sectoral or cross-sectional, I think, participation? Or how do you see the trade policy that a new Biden administration can shape towards China, which can help, for India to have a wider presence in terms of its own regional and international trade dynamics? I thank Vanshika and Shalu for these questions.
Thanks, Dipanshu. I lost you in the middle, but I think I got, the essence of what you're saying. I just want to throw up a little bit data, and I think that might sort of add context to our conversation. As you said, US and China are our biggest trade partners. But let's look a little bit at what happened in this year when India started scaling down on trade. Sure, the engagement with China went down. So, it was down about 15% in terms of our imports. But guess what? It was down 27% with the US. So, have we been able to cover any sort of arc in terms of becoming more self-reliant in the last year. I think it's very, very early to say that. I think it also boils down, and I wanted to put this point out right on top, it also boils down to a cost advantage. What is it that we are importing in the largest part from China? APIs, or active pharmaceutical ingredients, are a big part of what we get in. Electronics are another big part of what we get in. Auto parts are a big part of what we get in. And through the period of the lockdown last year, there was actually a point in time when, because of our tension at the border, it was impacting what India could get both on the pharmaceutical side from APIs, as also what was happening on the auto parts. So none of this is going to be a button that we can reset automatically. I think we should all be very clear about that. And the other part is scaling back, but to what extent, and can we actually scale back? So we'll have to have a huge dose of realism in that context. And I think many people from within the government, etc., have also pointed out that reeling back is not going to happen so easily. Perhaps what we have to look at is opening up the FDI route. That did happen during the union budget, at least for insurance, and that is something that India should actively look at, both in terms of gearing up capacity for our own country, and also making access for our Indian manufacturers easier to capital. They've got the know-how, they've got the entrepreneurial zing to them. Can they get the money in to come in and support them? That's one part of the conversation, Dipanshu. The other one was, when you talked about China versus everybody else. So now this is the ironic part, which is that despite getting so much pushback in terms of China's role with everything that went down in 2020, trade for China actually went up with every nation and every region. With the ASEAN region, with the EU, with the US, it's up about 8%. Even in a Trump administration where he said, "I hate them, I'm not going to do business with them," by the time he ended up, his tenure, it was actually up a bit versus down a bit from when he came on. So you can't ignore the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is China. I just want to also add one important point, Dipanshu, which is that you have to look at how India wants to approach this in terms of trade ties. So in the course of the last year, several extremely important trade pacts have been signed upon. There's RCEP, of course, which is for the Asian region and also Australia. The EU has just signed off on a trade deal with China. And before stepping down as president, actually, even President Trump, or former President Trump, also signed off on a trade pact with China. This is the way they want to do it. I'm not saying it's the right way or the wrong way, but this is their approach. India's approach has been to do minilaterals, smaller trade agreements that are not binding, that are more ad hoc in nature. Again, like I said, FDI versus FTA. So if you want to become a significant player, I think at some point you're going to have to bite the bullet in terms of where you stand on these trade agreements. There is another very large agreement that the US is in the process of signing. I think it used to be called the CPTP. It's been renamed now, but this could potentially be the largest global trade agreement. So there's some hard thinking to do on what our stand is in terms of trade agreements, because people are cobbling up their sort of corners of the pie very quickly, and we will need to move in that context. And the US as well is mindful of the fact that relations with China are sour, but I think they also have a huge dose of realism about the fact that you can't completely switch that button off with regards to trading with them.
Yeah. No, I think point taken. Akriti, please, if you want to respond.
Thank you, Dipanshu. Sorry, thank you. And my turn to say thanks to you and to the Center for New Economic Studies for having me. And like Mithali said, really a pleasure to be on a all-women panel, really a dream to be on this panel with Dr. Sethi and Mithali. And again, I don't have Mithali's expertise really on the US-India trade side of things. I don't really work on that. My expertise is more on the security and geopolitics and side of it. But I will say that from the context of US competition with China, particularly after COVID, moving production lines out of China and having conversations with countries such as India, such as Vietnam, about moving those production lines to those countries. I've heard conversations about that in the context of US-India, sort of US firms, what they need from India to be able to make that happen. And a lot of challenges still exist on that. If you are really trying to position yourself as a destination where, these production lines would come. More work needs to be done on, taxation reform. More work needs to be done on providing reliable land and electricity. More work needs to be done on, the business environment. So it's all, well and true to say from the geopolitical side that, we are partners and we want to work on this. But I think India sort of needs to make itself more attractive as a destination for that to happen.
Okay, I mean, just to ask a quick follow-up on this, and I've been more curious about this as well. Of late, and particularly last few years, and we are seeing that in the Indian context particularly, there is a conversation around a lack of trust, which has developed within I would say if you look at economic agents, households, firms, government, external sector, in the functioning or directionality of reform and policy, there's not much to really say that in effort there's a clear effort being done to do a lot there, and I think that's not to be disputed. But it is still not really crowding in the kind of investment that one would have hoped for. The numbers are not really adding up if you look at domestic private investment levels as well. And this is maybe a more internal question to the Indian scenario, but I do you sense, and I think maybe this is a question out open to anyone, Mitali, you could respond, or anyone else. How is this, maybe Akriti, would start with you. How is this, for example, being perceived in the US? How is India's own outlook being positioned in the US? It is definitely a very different projection of India, which has usually been around. And that is something that we are seeing. Do you see there is some kind of a change in outlook from the US side? And Mitali, do you see that even with the current budget, it is pushing for a more pro-growth outlook in the way it is perceiving it to be, projecting it to be? And that may be consistent with the government's outlook as well. But do you really see the private sector coming in when, for example, you've had problems on the demand side and in capacity generation for a while? The other is the kind of a challenge on credit and debt. I mean, I've been kind of really looking in and talking about this, that we've been underplaying the problem around debt in both the household debt segment and also the public sector as well, which will unpack itself as we move forward. So how are these, going? One is this perception about India, which I think Akriti could take, and in India's own economic fundamentals, if Mitali, you could respond, and then we can move to another theme. Yeah. Yes, Akriti, please.
Thanks, Dipanshu. So I will say I'm way out of my depth here. This is not really my area of expertise, but I will say that I think maybe what has happened is that the expectations of India and the US have been very, very high for a long time. And a lot of progress has been made on the defense and strategic side and not enough on the economic side. So a lot of analysts now worry that the problems that have existed in the US and the economic relationship, whether that's the failure of the trade deal, that's not gone forward, or anything else, will essentially, usurp the progress that's made in the relationship overall, and will really start impacting how the two countries interact. So from that point of view, I think maybe there is a lot of expectation on the economic side from the US with regard to India, and they want sort of more action on that, especially as Prime Minister Modi was seen as, a reform prime minister, sort of changing India and making it more muscular and progressive. So more was expected in terms of reforms. And I think the sense in the US is not enough has happened on that.
Okay. Yeah, Mitali?
So let me see if I can, cover some of the ground over there, Dipanshu. The first thing I'll say is that India actually has had a lot of goodwill, even globally. Perception has always been of a country where intent is positive, that's a big first step for us within the region as well. I think perhaps we got away with some of what was happening, at least in the international context, because the last couple of years have been about the macho man. I mean, I use that as a gender neutral term, but we've had these larger than life leaders, not just in our region, but also in Brazil. The US has had its own set of problems with Trump. So that I think has been a more global context. Trust, Dipanshu, comes with transparency. When there is no transparency, trust begins to diminish, and it begins to diminish quite hard. So why do we not have employment data for so many years? Why do we keep restating our GDP and changing the base year? This erodes trust. It's not a trust plus move to make, which is why when you get that data, your first reaction, whether you're an international analyst, I suppose, a rating agency, or someone who's looking at the economy here, is like, hey, is this adding up? Let me quickly take a look at whether this is adding up or not, and why is this not making sense? So I think that that trust deficit exists, especially in terms of what's happened on the economic front. What do we need to do from here? COVID has been such a difficult year, Dipanshu, not because it's been a pandemic, but because it's been the most unequal recession this world has ever seen. Some of us have come out of it unscathed. It has literally not affected our lives. I mean, it's affected our lives in terms of how we work, how we interact, how our kids go to school, but not at a very base economic level. Whereas there is this entire section of people that has been decimated. As you were talking about the financial crisis, I think that will come through on the MSME side, just as it did post demonetization. That is going to come through on the urban poor, the fact that they are not just jobless, but literally going hungry. Malnutrition numbers are rising for those children. So it's a really serious situation over there. On the finance side, what do you do with this? I think some got done in the budget. I think that was the plus point of the budget. Frankly, I think the finance minister bit the bullet and said, "Look, I'm coming clean. This is how bad it is with the fiscal deficit. I'm taking a lot of the off-budget items onto the budget. I'm ready to start on a fresh slate." And I think we should give her credit for that. It's more than any finance minister has done in many years gone by, and this is not about one party or the other. My problem or my concern really is, how is India addressing its very poor? I think in our zeal to sort of look like a very industry forward nation, we are forgetting about our responsibilities as a welfare nation, and we need to think about that. We need to be putting money into the pockets of those who need it the most. I'll just make one final point that you raised about the private sector side. Frankly, for my money, the private sector, if that's the corporates, and you're talking about the cream of the corporates, are the most mollycoddled bunch you'll ever see. They have got pretty much every loop that they could. The government has given them a really free rein. They have done zero in terms of capital expenditure, purely because they are just sitting tight in terms of the fact that they don't want to spend more. They got a corporate tax cut. What did they do with it? Zilch. That went straight to the bottom line. Numbers have been good for them in the year gone by. How did they do that? They did it by axing jobs and cutting costs. So I think the private sector really needs to get a dose of realism about what they have or have not done. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but they really have done nothing to contribute to capital expenditure. So how many more SOPs do you need before you start stepping up and really contributing?
No. I think and I think maybe it's a conversation of another time, but I've been arguing for talking about a consumption tax for so long, which is like a substitute to a wealth tax, because wealth tax is a cliche. But Manpreet ma'am, just on India's perception, and on that point, before we get into the regional and geopolitical spectrum, how do you see India's image, particularly in its in defense and security? How that's changing? There is clearly a lot of strong posturing, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think on the points made both by Akriti and Mitali, I'm in agreement with that in terms of how India is positioned outside, especially Mitali, your point about India always having goodwill. I think I completely go along with that, because the belief in the potential of India has never withered. I remember, especially in the decade of the 2000s, about 10 years after we had gone into our economic reforms, in all the international conferences that one attended in the period of the 2000s onwards, there was always this hope about India being the biggest kid on the block on the economic front, and that you would break out of many things. But as you said, there is a lack of trust in reforms, and they haven't taken the kind of pace that they could have for India to really break out of that. Also, if I can link it to the Indo-US nuclear deal, there was so much hope in there that that would be the breakthrough point for India to, get out of the kind of strangulated positions that we were in, and that we would be now able to position ourselves for participating in international nuclear commerce. Unfortunately, Fukushima happened at such a wrong point for India. I mean, never should a disaster of that kind happen. But 2011, when India was really poised for that position of reaching out to the rest of the world, was when so many things happened and changed the context in which India was going to engage with the nuclear community thereafter. So I would say that potential in India is still visible to everyone. And the problem has been that we have been harming ourselves with one thing or the other at different points in time, and not been able to really take off as we could. There's hope is always there, and I pin my hope on the youth, because they are going to be the ones who will think out of the box and find solutions for how you're going to position yourself in the rest of the world. The world, I think, is ready. You asked about geopolitical and security position of India. I think the understanding of what India's challenges are and the way it is handling those challenges is changed completely in the last a few years. When I would attend conferences in Europe earlier, there was just no understanding of the kind of challenges that were boxing us in. But today, the character of Pakistan and China is well understood by everyone. So everyone does understand what we are facing and the kind of challenges with the population, with the number of complexities of the population. All of that is well understood today. Finding the solutions has to come from within. Only then will we be able to sort of be seen differently.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Akriti, I mean, coming to one of your pieces that you published in The Diplomat, you mentioned there are significant continuities between the Indo-American relationship. These continuities most significantly include arms sales, easing up of bureaucratic hurdles, in co-production and co-development of defense equipment, and support for India's permanent membership at the UN Security Council. On the other hand, President Biden's press secretary, Jen Psaki, if I'm pronouncing it right, has already termed that in the recent years, China has presented a significant challenge to its, and I quote, security, prosperity, and values, end of quote. And there are significant tensions in Sino-Indian relationship since the clash between their security forces happened in Ladakh May of last year. So in such a conflicting scenario, what do you think are the range of strategic options China, for example, has to check the deepening of this Indo-American partnership? It's a question asked by Samarth. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dipanshu. So this question is really interesting, and I kind of interpret it a bit differently, and I think there can be sort of two diametrically opposite approaches that China could take if it has to check, or I guess respond to the deepening of the Indo-American partnership. So I think one way is for China to improve its relationship with India, to actually deliver on some of the interests and sensitivities of India. So delineate and demarcate the border, offer tangible cooperation, sort of invest in India, do the things, remove sort of the hurdles that is sort of put in India's positions in international institutions. But we know that, based on recent Chinese actions on the border, and as is indicated by various sort of writings by Chinese analysts in the last few years that blame India for the problems in the India-China relationship, that is unlikely to happen. And especially after the border standoff of 2020, we know that India's perceptions of China have fundamentally changed. And as we saw from Foreign Minister Jaishankar's recent speech, the India-China relationship is at a crossroads and it's profoundly impacted by the standoff. So I don't think the same sort of understandings or mechanisms that existed between India and China earlier are going to, hold much water, because there is such distrust in the relationship and in the sort of Chinese good faith interactions or understandings with India. So the other approach then for China would be to develop an even closer military and strategic relationship with Pakistan to keep India sort of bogged down on both fronts, which China's already been doing in terms of investments, right? So I think in that case, if that has to be sort of in response to the Indo-American partnership, I'm not sure that that's actually going to work. I think it'll actually have the opposite effect, that it will lead to India moving sort of closer to the US than moving away from the US, because a lot of the actions that India has taken in the last few years have been driven by what China has been doing on the border. I mean, India tried to reason with China and try to sort of take positions that would be offering sort of concessions to China in the last few years. Didn't, even though China blocked India's NSG bid, even though China sort of had all those issues with Masouda's designation at the UN, India still tried, even Prime Minister Modi tried to sort of develop a relationship with China through the Wuhan summit, through the Mamallapuram summit, tried to sort of, bring that relationship back to an even keel from Doklam. But, what do we have now? We have the border standoff. We have sort of this breakdown in the relationship. So I think either way, the sort of China-India relationship is going to really fundamentally change, and the India-US relationship, in both scale and complexity, has deepened and increased, and will do in the time to come. Because I also think that the relationship is broader than just managing the China challenge. The US-India relationship is very important from the point of view of science and technology partnership, from people-to-people ties on education, trade. So it is going to continue. And now we've seen, even with the Biden administration, that the focus on the Indo-Pacific theater is going to continue. We've seen repeated references in recent calls of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin or Secretary of State Antony Blinken in the calls with their counterparts about the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and India plays a central role in that, and it'll continue to sort of be a centerpiece of that strategy even in the Biden administration. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Ma'am, your thoughts on this? Anything you'd like to add? Yeah.
I think Akriti's articulated it very well, and I agree with that assessment of hers. China's wariness about Indo-US relations has always been there. I mean, I remember reading so many years back that even the 1962 war, the Chinese premier at that time had pointed out to say India was drawing too close to the US and it had to be taught a lesson. And so they've always been worried about how this is. And I think India has been extremely sensitive to this wariness of the US. And we found that reflected in our relationship with America. So extremely cautious about the way we were approaching the idea of the Quad, the Indo-Pacific. In fact, I always feel that when the Indo-Pacific Command was formulated, India became the belle of the ball without actually wanting to be that, because our concept of the Indo-Pacific was quite different from the military terms in which it was being conceived by the US. So we have had our reservations about drawing too close to the US, and I think we continue to maintain that sensitivity to the Chinese position on that till last year Galwan happened, which was really a breakthrough point, I think, for India's understanding of what to expect from China. So all your Wuhans and Mamallapurams completely, were seen to be useless attempts in trying to win Chinese goodwill on these issues. And however much the economic relationship had advanced or the levels of political engagement that were there with China, everything seemed to just fall apart because of the actions that were taken. It's not as if the aggression or the expansionist behavior of China was not visible before this, but I think there was a fundamental breach of trust that happened. And thereafter, we've heard several hardline statements come out from the Indian officials pointing out that it's not going to be possible to have business as usual unless things get back to normal at the line of actual control. China, on the other hand, has been arguing that we can compartmentalize this relationship and that the border road doesn't have to, implicate on other issues, which is a very strange position to take because the same China has been arguing against compartmentalization with the US. When the issue about climate change, etc., has come up and said everything has to be seen as part of the larger kitty. Now, so what we are in today's times is seemingly a position where you've got the extended hand of the US. We've got some fantastic military arrangements with the US, which, agreements that have been signed in the last few years. And on the other hand, you've got this belligerent neighbor who's at your doorstep. And I think India is at this important juncture where you are having to, like, it's the crossroads on Indo-China relations, but it's also the crossroads on the Indo-US relationship. Because going back in history, India has had its difficulties in drawing very close to the US also as part of our non-aligned history, as part of our lack of trust in the relationship with the US when they pulled out of our conventional arms arrangements or on the nuclear deal at different points in time. So there is a worry pattern there as well. How much can you trust? In the ultimate analysis, I think, and that's why you get back into that position about Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc. In the ultimate position on the defense front, India finds it'll have to fight its battles alone. It can definitely take help on intelligence front, on logistics, on acquisitions at different points in time. But the real battle at the border will have to be by ourselves. So therefore, trying to have a political engagement with China in order to, ward off any such possibility is as important as our relationship with the US. And we are caught in that. I think it's the Chinese behavior which is ultimately going to determine the trajectory of the Indo-US relations, because both of them are ready and waiting, especially the US, but India has had its reservations. So the more China pushes India on many of these fronts and wants India not to engage with the US, it's actually going to do itself a disservice and push India into into US lap.
Yeah, so just, and Dipanshu Singhal, not myself, but Dipanshu Singhal, a student associated with the center, asks, and I think this is addressed to Akriti, in the summer of 2018, Trump renamed the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command, pointing towards a policy outlook favoring India and at the same time attempting to encircle China in the South China Sea. Do you think the Biden administration will continue with a strong, aggressive narrative against China, or you sense a resurgence of the Obama era diplomacy trying to coax China into becoming more, quote unquote, democratic? I was about to say dramatic. Or will the world get to see a totally new form of the pivot to Asia policy strategy?
Thanks, Dipanshu. This is, the million-dollar question. I think there's actually been a lot of debate in US policy circles, but also broadly in Asia about what the Biden administration's policy is going to be towards China and the Indo-Pacific more broadly. I think it's a little too early to tell because we're only in, month 2 of the administration. So we're still waiting for them, to lay out a lot of the positions. But I will say that, at least based off of some of the statements that have come out in the last few months, and also the officials who've been appointed to the Biden administration, the concerns that existed a little bit, last few months about, the Biden administration being a little soft on China, those have dissipated because we've seen that, whether it is the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan or Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin or Secretary of State Antony Blinken, they've all sort of come out with a position which recognizes that China is sort of the primary challenge that the US is facing. And they especially I found there was a recent speech that and the National Secretary Advisor Jake Sullivan gave where he spoke about great power competition with China, but very interestingly framing it as the US needing to sort of strengthen its own internal positions, whether it's with regard to democratic institutions or with regard to the economy or with regard to technological innovation to be able to deal with China. So I think, if you look at, like I said, some of the other officials as well, such as Eli Ratner, who is going to be special assistant to the Secretary of Defense on China, or others such as Laura Rosenberger, all of them have a very sort of clear-eyed sense of the challenge that China poses. And even, actually from yesterday, the statement that Secretary of State Blinken made, the call that he had with Yang Jiechi, the top diplomat in China, which was very candid about how they see China, the threats that China is posing to the Indo-Pacific, but also the concerns that they have about China's actions in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong. I think it gives you a sense of the seriousness with which the Biden administration is going to take the relationship with China. But I also think that there is going to be a little bit of a cooperative element on issues that do require that. For example, climate change. The Biden administration realizes, and they've come to power on the votes of a lot of progressives who want strong action on these issues, on sort of renewable energy and climate change. So they do have to engage with China on those issues. But I think I feel pretty good about the sense, right now in the US about. I think there is actually bipartisan consensus in China, in the US right now about the threat that China poses. But I think we still have a little bit more. We need more time to see what the exact policies are going to be like.
Makes sense. You mentioned about climate change, and I want to bring Mitali in here. And this is a question that was asked by Dia. Joe Biden, in his manifesto, has proposed to invest $2 trillion in green energy. And I mean, it's a very ambitious plan on combating climate change. His drive to switch to a green economy by 2035 is surely ambitious. Could you highlight, I would probably say, just to add on, where is India, potential partner for for the US to consider on trying to expand its ties in areas of renewable energy? I've seen tremendous potential in solar. Being based out in Haryana, I've done field work in some villages where solar is now clearly picked up big time. And in the next 5 years, I see solar completely replacing. I mean, there at least just to give an example, out of every 5 villages that we were surveying, almost 4 had gone solar, 80% for power generation utility purposes. So there is clearly the gap in not having access to non-renewable forms of power has created a space for renewable energy source, particularly through solar battery operated sectors. So where is India's potential there to partner with the US in terms of any sectors that you can identify? Or is there any role that you think China could play as well as America's largest trading partner to make use of the opportunity? I mean, China's question, I think, is a different one, but maybe where you want to look at India and the US there, because this is a question which I think had 2 competing points. Yeah.
No, of course. I just wanted to quickly make a point, if I may, Dipanshu, about the conversation that was happening earlier, and I completely agree with Dr. Sethi. This is a 3-way position for India. It's India and it's China and it's what happens with the US. But first of all, Indo-Pacific, absolutely. I mean, think about this yourselves. 3 years back, did you hear terms like the Quad? Did you hear talk of Indo-Pacific? It was nowhere in the context of conversations about strategic ties or otherwise. Now it is genuinely something which is making parties like China uncomfortable. All this talk about Quad, because it includes Australia as well. So that is certainly something that is suddenly out there and being discussed. I would add, another player into the mix, which is Russia. I think that sort of really muddies the mix for India, because traditionally this has been someone who has been a strong ally. But here comes this entire event that went down in China, and there's been clearly both overt and covert support in favor of China. In comparison to that, the US has actually been a far more vocal supporter of India through this entire process in terms of the tension with China. So I think India is in a tricky position in terms of how closely it wants to sit with the US and how much it wants to alienate with Russia. And that's, given it a bit of a sticky spot. I just wanted to add also in terms of these, the trade conversation for India. I don't know if your students have, heard of this, but I would encourage them to look it up. It's called CATSA, which is Countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act. It's a mouthful of an act, but this is potentially seen as more dangerous than any, just any sanctions or anything like that. Ostensibly, this is being done for countries like North Korea, etc. But the US has been very clear about the fact that they will clear anything by a case-by-case basis. India has no carte blanche. They don't have, clear checks against all the boxes if indeed their case comes up for hearing. I think this could potentially make things more uncomfortable for India, particularly when it's not got a great situation going with this colossus of a neighbor, and it's not got as traditionally warm relations as it had with an ally like Russia. So genuinely, this is not an easy place for India to be in, and it's going to have to play this very, very tactically. On the second part, the question that you just asked, Dipanshu, no, genuinely, there's tremendous potential. I think for India, it's a no-brainer. There is so much potential in terms of sustainable finance. As you said, solar is huge. Hydro is coming in as well. Not just Haryana, Maharashtra has done a lot of great work.
Yeah.
But I think we need to stop thinking of the US as the benefactor of all in this context, because there are many other nations that are doing tremendous work in sustainable change, far more than the US actually, in terms of, addressing their goals as well. And there's a lot more money. COP26 comes up this year. It got postponed from last year. The UK is an interested party. There are several large-sized pension funds that are looking to invest in India. Green bonds generally have a much better rate. So there's a lot for India to tap into. And, this can even happen at a muni bond level, Dipanshu, like municipal bonds. Cities can go and make those changes. It doesn't have to be India saying, yes, I support sustainable finance. It can be Mumbai or Delhi saying, yes, I want to do this and I'm going to raise fund in that regard. So yes, I mean, this is clearly something where we have a lot of potential and there's a lot of money interested. So this is a win-win for us.
So, which countries do you see that I mean, just on the question on partnership on renewable energy for India, at least in the neighborhood, I personally definitely see a lot of potential for cooperation with Bhutan, which I think we have not really tapped in a lot much. But any other countries that you find that potential for partnership going beyond US or China, let's say, to bring other countries into the mix as well? Yeah.
I think in the regional level, we should certainly look at not emerging anymore, actually, standout economies like Vietnam. They've done a fantastic job of tiding through COVID and then what they've done after. My only problem with this, Dipanshu, is that we're going to have to work harder and sort of pedal double that any other nation would be, because we're making this conscious choice to not be part of trade agreements. So a lot of stuff could be getting circled within communities of, say, RCEP or the EU community. Now we are not part of it. We are welcome, but we are not part of it, and that's the reality of it. So we're going to have to work harder to get a leg into these conversations. But Vietnam comes to mind quite immediately. Like I said, the UK is interested. The EU has been interested. So there's a bunch of other regions that we could be speaking to in terms of renewable finance and funding. Yeah,
no, I think that's a good point. We have actually a journal issue currently being worked around climate finance and cooperation. So that's the reason I was pushing you, because there's a team listening in. So we entered the last part of our conversation for today, and this is with respect to our discussion around security implications. So Manpreet ma'am, we'll have you a little busy responding to a few questions students have. I'll start with the first question that Samvad asks. In one of your pieces in the Eurasia Review, you mentioned that China and India are the only two countries that offer an alternative perspective on nuclear weapons and deterrence. No first use policy and low alert levels. You also argue that the most challenging part of this relationship is China's material support to Pakistan. With the nature of current tensions prevailing in the dynamics of Sino-Pakistan, Sino-American, and Indo-Pakistan relationship, do you think India and China can evolve new or alternative mechanisms or institutions to arrive at a bilateral understanding, particularly in terms of issues of nuclear security? What role can the US play under President Biden in this regard? Your response, ma'am.
Thank you, Dipanshu. Very interesting question, but there's a lot there that needs to be unpacked. And I'm glad someone is interested and has drawn attention to the nuclear dynamics in Southern Asia, which is perhaps the most complex dynamics that you have on the nuclear front. So in Southern Asia, and as you pointed out as part of your question, we've got two adversarial dyads. You have India, China, and India, Pakistan. And you've got a benign arrangement between China and Pakistan in terms of the help that one gives to the other. But you also have the shadow of the extra-regional US on China. So within the complexity of Southern Asia, we have what I have started calling the chain conundrum, where what happens at the US level in terms of its nuclear capability buildup, doctrine, posture, impacts what happens in China, and then it filters down into India and Pakistan. Now, despite China and India having their nuclear weapons, because of the approach that they have in terms of their doctrinal issues, I would say it's still the most stable nuclear relationship. And as you referred to this article of mine, where I've argued that despite the Indo-China standoff now being almost, 8 or 10 months old, even then the nuclear word has not been mentioned, which is very different from what happens when there is a crisis between India and Pakistan, because Pakistan wants to draw attention to the nuclear issue right at the beginning. But India and China have not spoken about the nuclear, dimension. They have not drawn attention to their nuclear capabilities, essentially because both of us, with our declaratory no first use positions, because of the fact that we have, the same approach about nuclear weapons being for deterrence and not for war fighting, there is that sense of stability between the two. But we also know that China has very effectively used Pakistan as a proxy for building up that capability and to contain India, in a sense, by letting, and you mentioned material help, but I think I also want to say that China helps Pakistan by bolstering its confidence in whatever it wants to do behind the shadow of nuclear weapons. So every time there is a terrorist attack in India or in Pakistan, you will see an article in the Global Times which will mention that Pakistan is also a victim of terrorism. So you are actually promoting or encouraging that behavior of brinksmanship, besides providing it with material help also. Very interestingly, in the last, some of the last few months engagements that I've had with some of the Chinese scholars, they've started arguing that India's conventional buildup, which is largely happening, because we didn't do it for a long period of time, or because of the two-front war scenarios that we have. They believe that this is going to upset the strategic stability relationship with Pakistan that India has, and therefore they are compelled to help Pakistan on both the conventional and the nuclear front. Now, I think this is a rather mischievous argument to make, because the Chinese-Pakistan help to each other's military buildup has been there for such a long period of time. Can India and China evolve mechanisms for nuclear stability? Well, I used to argue in that favor, to say that because we've got a similarity of approach on nuclear issues, here is what we can provide as an answer to the rest of the world, which doesn't believe in the concept of no first use. But you've got a unique situation between India and China. Unfortunately, I think things have changed since Galwan, and there is a trust problem that India today has. China always had the attitude problem with India, because they would always tell you that you are an illegitimate nuclear power, not having been part of the non-proliferation treaty, and therefore we cannot have a nuclear dialogue with you. Every time you wanted to engage on nuclear CBMs or talk about nuclear issues, they would point out to the fact that as part of the UN Security Council resolution, you should actually be dismantling your nuclear weapons, and that you are not worthy of being engaged with on the nuclear issue. What could be the role of the US? Well, I don't think directly the US has a role in this relationship. India has always made it very clear that both with China and Pakistan, these are bilateral relationships, and they will be resolved at the bilateral issue. During crisis, yes, the US comes in some form or the other, and over a period of time, we've seen that role changing. But the useful role that the US, I think, can play, and what the Biden administration has hinted at, I don't know how far they can take it, but that is if the US and China were to look at some form of strategic stability dialogues or nuclear arms control. after the New START has been renewed between the New START treaty has been renewed between US and Russia, they have mentioned that new arms control will be by bringing China into the picture. And if in some form China can be brought in, even if these are not verifiable agreements, but there are some political sort of statements that are made which bring China into the picture on nuclear arms control and strategic stability, that would be, I think, helpful to India in terms of not getting sucked into any kind of an arms race on this issue with China. So that's where I find the US could play a useful role. But apart from that, in terms of direct participation between India and China, not possible. And if the larger engagement between India and China changes, then there is scope for nuclear CBMs as well.
And thank you, ma'am. That was the question for as an observer. So I've had very little understanding of looking at security dynamics, but if one had to observe what exactly that you're putting in context, where one would start over the next, year or 3 years in terms of looking at, the discussions around arms race or the stakeholders involved going beyond India, China, or the US. I mean, I'm just asking as a student, what will be the key areas that one would want to focus to get a better understanding of these issues? I mean, if you have a few references that you would suggest for one to follow, that would be helpful.
So Dipanshu, a lot of work on this issue has been happening. I would suggest, for instance, looking at journals like Arms Control Today, Foreign Affairs, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which are always good in terms of understanding what the current administration positions are and how it's impacting some of the stakeholders in the whole business. So they would be good reference points. Within India, well, the Center for Air Power Studies has been doing some amount of work on nuclear issues, and our website has some of the writings of the various.
Yeah, I was coming at, yeah.
So
yeah, I was trying to come to the center's work because it might be great for also students to be exposed, and maybe we can have a separate conversation around this where a focus group can have a more elaborate dialogue on this. Just on this, and before I get Akriti into the question, there was a question around how all three countries, US, this is by Rahil, US, India, and China have rejected recent nuclear disarmament treaties in form of the TPNW, despite demonstrating a strong commitment to these in public rhetoric. Do we expect nuclear deterrence to be a critical component of, and I think this is an important question, of regional and national security protocols in the near future? What are your thoughts on this? Manpreet ma'am, and then Akriti. Yeah.
Thank you, Rahil, for your question. But before I come to that, I just wanted to mention, Dipanshu, since you said possibilities of engagement with the Center for Air Power Studies. So we do take interns from universities, when they have their free period to come and be at the center. And the other is to have security capsules. We do them over 3 days or 5 days with different universities where they are exposed to national security in all its complexity and different dimensions. Which goes down very well with the young scholars, and they often, have really good questions to ask and solutions to offer to many of the problems that vex us. To the question about TPNW. Now, Rahil, TPNW, for the benefit of the larger audience, is the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is a new legal instrument that has just entered into force less than a month ago. It was on the 22nd of January that this entered into force, and it was largely pushed for by the non-nuclear weapon states through the United Nations General Assembly, which concluded this agreement and put it out for signature of people. The treaty has been, it essentially bans the production, acquisition, manufacture, possession, threat, use of nuclear weapons. And as I said, this is the only legal instrument that is actually banning nuclear weapons and putting them out. But unfortunately, for the time being, it's only banning them for the people who don't have this weapon, because it's the non-nuclear weapon states who are member states of this treaty. And as you mentioned, three names, but actually all the 9 nuclear armed states that exist today have rejected the treaty and said that this is not the way to get to disarmament. Of course, the rhetorical position of everyone on disarmament continues. Now, I would just want to explain what India's position is, because India has been seen as the champion of nuclear disarmament. So why was it that we were not keen on a treaty like this? Some of the arguments that have been made, or the points that India has offered for rejecting the treaty, is essentially that it was not consensually negotiated. So it was done not at the Conference on Disarmament, which is seen to be the body where you should be negotiating disarmament agreements. But most importantly, it does not. It's not a verifiable treaty, and it does not have any enforcement mechanism for countries that cheat on it. So you are just making an individual declaration. There is no time schedule which has been laid down by the treaty by which you would destroy your nuclear weapons, who would monitor when you're destroying them, who would ascertain that that the statement that you're making is correct, and in case you're found cheating, who is going to enforce compliance. So these are some of the questions that the treaty has left unanswered. Supporters of the treaty say that this is a normative agreement, and the idea is that we have put this out, and now it's up to the nuclear weapon states to flesh it out and make it verifiable and make it enforceable. Unfortunately, the second part of your question was, are we, for the time being, destined to live with deterrence as our security protocol? Yes, we are, because we are just so wedded to the idea of deterrence and to the fact that nuclear deterrence is bringing a certain amount of strategic stability into relations. So it is seen to be a good thing. There are people who argue that if nuclear weapons were to go away, the world will dissolve into a number of wars, because nuclear weapons have kept wars at bay. Now, there is no way of either proving or disproving this assumption that people make. But the point is, the more nuclear weapons continue to stay with us, the greater are the risks that they bring. Some of the new technologies like hypersonics, like artificial intelligence, like cyber offensives, the more they begin to intersect with nuclear deterrence, the greater are the dangers of inadvertent escalation. No two nuclear countries will go to a deliberate nuclear war with each other because they understand the consequences of what will happen. Both sides have a secure second strike capability, which will bring back retaliation. But inadvertent escalation, or you're stumbling into a nuclear war, is the danger that we are facing today. We are also facing the problem of more countries wanting to acquire nuclear weapons. So if North Korea is not giving up its nuclear weapons, and China is also the threatening factor, you have Japan and South Korea wanting to have nuclear weapons. So deterrence seems to have taken rather deep roots in our understanding of security situations, and we seem to be destined to live with it till we can loosen that grip, which can only happen if you start reducing the value of nuclear weapons. Human nature is you don't give up something that you attach value to. And that's where the TPNW fails, because it goes straight to banning the weapon without taking away the value of the weapon first. And that has been the argument in favor of disarmament, that you will have to take a step-by-step approach and get to that position, rather than take the sledgehammer approach that the ban treaty seems to have taken.
So just a very quick question, follow up quickly. How is the jurisprudence in international law? How have you seen that evolve over the last few years to settle the voids that you were mentioning with the treaty? How do you see that shaping up? Because there's a lot of change happening in the international legal framework as well, with this waning multilateralism of sorts, where not many countries are settling in for dispute settlement through IL or international law frameworks. How do you see this in the nuclear context?
Dipanshu, unfortunately, the international humanitarian law dimensions, as a weapon of mass destruction, IHL, none of those parameters the WMD can meet. So it has never been within the ambit of law. In 1996, the International Court of Justice had passed a ruling which said that, yes, it's up to the nations for self-defense. If they are forced to use nuclear weapons, it would not be against the law. So, and that's why I said the only legal instrument that has come into being is the TPNW. But a treaty like that you have to be a member of that for it to apply to you. So there is this rather difficult relationship between international humanitarian law and nuclear weapons. There is a lot of gray area there, which countries tend to exploit. In fact, in recent times, I have seen some writings come up which tend to want to conventionalize nuclear weapons by suggesting that if it was done through proportionate use, or if it was low yield use of nuclear weapons, it would fall within the ambit of international law. Yeah. And I find this scary and disconcerting, because then you are actually making it legal for nuclear weapons to be used. Whereas the whole idea of nuclear deterrence was, because the effect of the weapon cannot be constrained in space and time, you should not want to use this nuclear weapon at all. So somebody can think of a low yield use of nuclear weapons, but he could get back a large scale nuclear weapon back on himself. So there is no way of constraining. Once nuclear weapons get used, well, the sky is the limit for the kind of damage that can happen as a result of it. So I would rather not go down that route of wanting to legalize or marry international law with nuclear weapons.
Yeah. No, I think that's a salient point. Akriti, do you want to kind of quickly respond? We have one question and then we'll wrap up the next 10 minutes.
I would not even pretend to, answer that question, because Dr. Sethi did a fantastic job. The only thing I wanted to add to the earlier conversation about resources to learn about, deterrence and arms control. So the Stimson Center actually has a set of online courses on these issues. So if you go to our strategic learning initiative, we actually have two courses, one which is Nuclear South Asia, that's focused on sort of India and Pakistan's nuclear history, posture doctrines. And the newest one is on deterrence as a whole, deterrence in Southern Asia, and that actually talks about, what Dr. Sethi was talking about, the nuclear strategic chain. It talks about, the US-China relationship, the China-India relationship, the India-Pakistan relationship in a nuclear context. And so if, students are interested in that, it's a free course available online. You can sign up for that.
Yeah. Thank you, Akriti. Mitali, did you want to quickly jump in to add a question for Manpreet ma'am? Because I know we've not been able to squeeze in cross questions from panelists to each other. That would have been nice to do, but this would have gone for a couple of hours.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say this was it was a crash course in everything about nuclear and nuclear proliferation. And I was just sitting here and listening completely in rapture. So thank you so much for, sharing the wealth of your knowledge with us. I just had a quick question, perhaps in terms of, it's always tough to do this crystal ball gazing, but if you look out over the next couple of years, what would you say looks like the single biggest security threat worldwide? Do you think it will emanate from North Korea? Do you think it is indeed a US-China situation that's going to come to boil? What do you think we have to be mindful of the most?
That's a tough question to answer, because there are so many things on the boil at the same time. So yes, I don't see a nuclear conflict between US and China, or between India and China, or between India and Pakistan. As I said earlier, the possibility of miscalculation, misperception, actually getting us into some kind of an escalation situation is what worries me. In fact, this is also what was reflected. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is a publication. And since 1947, they've been maintaining what is known as the clock phase, where 12 o'clock is nuclear Armageddon, or the death of humanity and the world. And every year they change the hand of minutes to indicate how far or close you are to that midnight. So at the moment, and they change this, the time is changed in January every year. So on the 27th of January this year, we are at 100 seconds to midnight, which is the closest we have ever been. The farthest that we've been is at 17 minutes to midnight, which was at the end of the Cold War. But over a period of time, as the situations have become more and more complex and difficult, we become closer and closer. And even if we were at, I think, at the start of the decade, 2010, we were at about 6 minutes to midnight. So between 2010 and 2020, we've covered so much of a distance, and there isn't really much more time adjustment that can be done. The idea of this clock phase is to draw attention to the kind of risks that we are facing. And the political leaders must understand what are the consequences of their policies and the way they are heading. I am hopeful that President Biden and Akriti, I hope you will push for this in the US, will be able to bring out a more responsible nuclear posture review, which is able to, because the US sets the fashion on the nuclear street. So President Trump had spoken about the idea of limited nuclear wars and how in regional contingencies, if there was, for instance, a conflict between US and China over Taiwan, that you could do a limited use of nuclear weapons. And my worry is you can never do a limited use of nuclear weapons. So therefore, the nuclear posture review, if it was to bring back the role of weapons to the essential core, which is nuclear deterrence, not expand the role of the weapons to say it is against space contingencies, spy, cyber, conventional, everything. I don't think that's the right way to go. So we need to start constricting the role of the weapon. No first use is a great strategy because you're suggesting that the use will not happen till you are attacked. And that is, again, constraining the use of the weapon. So I would want that to happen from the US, and I think that will have a good effect on the others. But meanwhile, North Korea, Iran, all of these remain up in the air for the time being. So no, I don't have a quick and easy answer, Mitali, to your question. But that's my sense of the nuclear situation right now.
So just, very quickly, because this is the final question which Pratul and Vanshika had. And this brings Pakistan into the mix. We've not had too much to mention about Pakistan during the scope of our conversation previously. Do you think US, and this is a question jointly to Manpreet ma'am and Akriti, if you want to respond, do you think US close relationship with Pakistan, that is militarily, will affect India's response to the United States at any point of time in the scheme and scope of defense cooperation arrangements? Or how do you see India's relationship with the US to evolve, which is independent of the troubles in India-Pakistan dynamic? I think this is a question which comes in quite often, I think, because everybody wants to know what's happening between India and Pakistan, and does that have a bearing on in the ties of one country with respect to a third country as well. Finally, just very quickly to add on that, China too has been supporting and heavily investing in building Pakistan's infrastructural capabilities. Does this tilt the scale of balance of power in favor of Pakistan when it comes to the subcontinent, or is it something which is too easy said than done? Maybe Akriti, you could go in first, and then Manpreet ma'am could respond and have a final word. Yeah.
So that is a lot of questions that I doubt I can answer in 3 to 4 minutes. But actually, before I get into that, I just wanted to add one point to what Mitali was talking about earlier about the CAATSA sanctions, possibility of CAATSA sanctions on India. I think, so yes, it's a really difficult situation. We don't really know what the Biden administration is going to do. But I did want to mention, just to add some nuance to the conversation from the US side, that in my understanding, at least, there is recognition in the US that India is dependent on Russia because it is a legacy partner for India. That obviously India's just day-to-day arms and ammunition quotas are so dependent on Russia that I don't think they are blind to that. I think they understand the issues that India has in terms of moving away from dependence on Russia, but it is a politically really difficult situation because of everything that's happened in the last 4 years with US-Russia relations in terms of Russian interference in US elections. So it's become a really political issue now, but I will say that there is a provision to provide a waiver in some situations with certain countries, especially those that will say that they will protect any US systems that they're using along with any Russian systems, as well as if they reduce the significant transactions that they have, and also work with the US. So on a lot of those points, India does actually can be eligible for a waiver. So I just wanted to add that. On US-Pakistan relations, I think that the question initially was sort of about the change that has happened, or seemingly that has happened, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, at least based on the last, the comments that we've heard from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So I think that obviously there has been a change in that. The Trump administration was very sort of rhetorically negative on Pakistan. They did cut, security and security assistance to Pakistan. And so in many ways, the Biden administration is trying to sort of reverse some of those drastic measures, right? They are saying we want to engage with the Pakistan military, we want to have dialogue, we want to, restore security assistance, we want to work with them in Afghanistan. But none of that is new if you look at the trajectory of the US-Pakistan relations, right? A lot of it is sort of reversal to what the Obama era policy was towards Pakistan. And whatever, I know that there is, a lot of concern in India about this sometimes, but the US legitimately needs Pakistan as a partner in Afghanistan. So, that is not really something that's negotiable. And that is something that India's dealt with in the past. So I don't think that it, like I was saying earlier, the scale and complexity of the US India relationship is just, it can't really be compared to the US-Pakistan relationship. It's much deeper, it's much more broad-based as a relationship. And also, add the China challenge. If you look at it from the Indo-Pacific lens, the US-India relationship is extremely important. And even if you look at it from the Afghanistan counterterrorism lens, the Biden administration has said that they want to work with India on these issues as well. So I think that, probably making a little bit too much of a deal out of these comments, I think it doesn't really impact the trajectory of the US-India relationship.
Yes, ma'am, the final word.
I wanted to make a very quick point
Yeah.
before Dr. Sethi speaks, because I know she will have so much, more to add to it. But I want to say this to students of economics who have, logged in for this conversation. Think about this now in terms of, what India's priority should be in terms of spending. As we went into the union budget, there was a loud call for upping defense budgets to about 3% of GDP, saying that would be somewhat of a rough figure. But look at it now from India's point of view, where we have not one, but two active borders. So you've got a situation in Pakistan, which is a running situation, but now you have a highly escalated situation with the China border as well. It means more boots on ground. It means more machinery. It also means, a whole other level of conflict, because with China, you're also talking about AI, you're talking about technology. We don't even know if we have that kind of know-how, forget about allocating money. So, I just wanted to bring home the point that it's such a tough spot for India to be in economically as well, to make these priorities, because, for a lot of people, the argument also is, and I'm sure Dr. Sethi will add to this, that, if you've dealt with Pakistan, then dealing with, China, that's the big one. If you can fix that one, then this one is, sort of small fry relatively. But think about this, whenever you're thinking about looking at problems on an economic basis, try and put all this into the mix and just sort of be mindful of how tough this situation is. I just wanted to make that quick point.
No, I think that's great. The idea was through this conversation to have those cross linkages developed into the conversation. Yes, ma'am. Off to you, and we'll have the final words before we close. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Mitali, I'm so glad you brought attention to this very, very valid point, because often we lose sight of it. And the moment, I'm sure even now there are people who are watching and studying India's budget will start making noises about how we've increased our defense spending by a little bit, even though it's just, I think, a very marginal increase in capital expenditure, which is going to go up. But look at the complexities of our security relationship. And that's why partnerships with different countries become so important, because by ourselves, we are not going to be able to ever have the kind of military budgeting which will be necessary for the complexity of our security. But to get back to the question on Pakistan, well, nations craft their foreign policies based on national interests. And I think this is well understood by India in terms of where the US finds Pakistan important for them. And I would go along with Akriti to say we don't need to read the fine, with a tooth comb, try to get everything and do hair splitting of every statement that comes out of the US on Pakistan, because there was a time when that was a matter of concern for us. But I think Pakistan is pretty much irrelevant to the Indo-US relations now. There are concerns that happen because when the US wants to give it military hardware, ostensibly for fighting terrorism, but where it really has no role against terrorism, but can be used against India. So there are concerns like that, but I think the Indo-US relationship has come a certain amount of distance of friendship for us to be able to voice those concerns to the US and for the US to take them on board. There is also greater understanding of what Pakistan's role is. You know, the US has always been thinking of Pakistan as part of the solution, but Pakistan is also part of the problem in Afghanistan. And that understanding is also seeped into the US right now. So uh, that relationship, ideally, what India always wanted was to be dehyphenated in the relationship that was there between India, Pakistan, and US, and we've managed to do that. So, what the US does with Pakistan, and I'm hoping, because the US has shown itself to be myopic on several of these issues in the past, I'm hoping after the kind of lessons that they've learned about Pakistan's behavior, and given the kind of relationship that they now have with India, they will not be myopic in their in some of the going back that they do on that relationship with Pakistan. So we leave it there because there's a lot that can be said on this, but I can see we are up,
Yeah.
from the time that you had set for all of
Yeah.
us. But
Yeah, no, and but I just wanted to take this moment to thank each one of you for taking the time to spend this evening on a weekend, and I also want to thank Shubham, our IT point of contact, who had basically very little reason to give all the time that he did, and thank you to the IT and AV support staff, Samarth, Vanshika. Thank you for the excellent list of questions that the students. I mean, there were so many, and when I was kind of in the middle of looking at this, I was like, well, this is going to be a little tough because a lot of areas where I fall short of finding value in drawing a linkage in the conversation that's needed across the board. But I think we did good. Thank you so much, Manpreet ma'am, for your illuminating conversation. And I think there's a lot for us to think about. I request students to look at the center's work very closely, Center for Air Power Studies. Thank you, Akriti, again, for taking the time out for coming. I also request students to check the Stimson Center's South Asia program and South Asia Voices. There's some excellent work going on, and more importantly, a very good space to write and pitch in your submissions. Mitali, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to come and be part of this. And we look forward to, we have at least one conversation that we'll schedule on the 20th of February, which will be the last Samvad for this semester. But just with your permission, panelists, I think your emails might be a part of a list where the center's work usually passes on. So I hope that's acceptable and that's all right. If at any point of time you want to be out of the list, you could let the team know. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.